Hey everyone, welcome back and thank you for being here. Um, it's pretty late. Sophia's got crazy zoomies, and I've got an assortment of the aforementioned toy arsenal Winchester because due to her zoomies, he is a little bit um confused. He's trying to play with her and he's never because she's never really had zoomies before like this. He's usually asleep when she gets them. I'm like, bro, chill. Like you can't chase her. She's gonna get scared. Um, let's get this shared. I'm gonna go over the first two sections. We already did the introduction, and we did the foreword by Sebastian Gardner, and we did a bibliography introduction from the John Hopkins or Johns Hopkins. Might have been a typo. Anyway, doesn't really matter. That was in episode one of the entire overview of, not the entire overview. It's obviously not comprehensive. A fairly comprehensive overview of, I don't know, the last 125 years since phenomenology got started. So it's also been about 125 years since like Bergson and James and Dewey. Um, a lot of interesting thinkers have not been digested by society yet, not fully. So Sartre is 1939, as is on the video and on the podcast and all that stuff. We just got to get into it. Um, we do have some fresh guiding questions. I can spend a little bit more time going over the dog toys first, though, because I know that's what everybody actually wants to see. This is a purple Kong that my little sister got for him. It's very indestructible. This is a it's a squeaker. He usually destroys or eats the squeakers. Sorry, I didn't mean to just he's focused on it now. Um, and it's got a little it actually throws like a football. I throw it like that and it spins and it does really well. We have a straight shot behind the house that he gets to, it's pretty much out the kitchen door. And then this is a Duraplay from Walmart or something, earth rated, but he doesn't really like it. It doesn't squeak. It's kind of hard to chew on. He wants it right now, but he's gonna leave it alone. Like he just doesn't mess with it. He barely fetches, but and then this one is a Wrangler toy, and he's clearly loved that one quite a bit. So, all right. What is the finality of emotion? Start with our guiding questions. Um, the finality of emotion is a sort of, my former notes say that it's a self-sufficient quality of roundedness, completeness, absolute. You can kind of think of it like the aesthetic consummation in Dewey. It's in itself, there's a moreness to it, it's signification. It's a stop or an end. Um, it has meaning. That's all correct. Not sure if I would add much to it. Um, I would try to point you to find it in your own experience to try to identify that like with those details in yeah, just in your own perception. Two, why are James's peripheric theory and Janet's intellectualist theory of emotion similarly inadequate solutions to the mind-body problem for the same reason? I started to explain this at the end of the last video. Um, there are a lot of details to it, and it's best to just read those, and we will in this episode. So keep that in mind. Think about James's peripheric theory or body-based, and Janet's intellectualist theory. The issue with James is one embodied perception of embodied perception at a secondary level, even if it's the same thing. Um, which is kind of how he describes James's peripheric theory. It's whenever the consciousness becomes self-aware of what the body is already doing. And he says that this can't account for the different meanings that have similar bodily states, like elevated heart rate and anxiety and joy alike, but they have different meanings and they come from different sources for different reasons. And Janet's intellectualist theory, uh, it turns emotion into a disorder, but that doesn't make sense with the finality of emotion because a disorder cannot feel like an ordered, coherent thing. So it can't be a breakdown or a failure of ability. And if it is a failure of ability, it has to still be an ownership of agency, which is Sartre's point. And which is why he then goes on to Giame, Lewin, and Dembo. Among the disciples of Kohler, I don't know who Kohler is either. I don't see Kohler mentioned again. Um, and yeah, he says that if the mind or if we consider consciousness to be a set of adaptive behaviors that are on circuits that can break down, then it's essentially still just like mechanistic theory, even if it's supposed to have some kind of qualitative or felt or phenomenological component that is above and beyond, right? Which is the finality. Um, I think finality is also related to discreteness. So why is emotion not will or memory? What is different? And Sartre says this at one point in the introduction. In fact, actually, it's only to the psychologist that this happens, that it seems separate from attention and memory. And you can kind of sketch them separately, and they have a separate eidetics when you isolate them, quote unquote. But going back to what Bergson says, you can never really isolate any one component from the psyche or from the continuum of experience. That's true for phenomenology as well. So this is why repeatedly Sartre says that every phenomena can be interrogated about every other phenomena or every kind of component of consciousness. Yeah, it seems like he just had a lot of energy earlier. Yeah. You want this one? There you go. I was talking about, yeah. Anyway, what is Sartre's alternative, which is an adaptation of Janus theory? Um, More specifically, it's an adaptation of Lewin and Dembo's theory through Giame, but that's also an adaptation of Janus theory, and it's an adaptation of James's as well. Really, the first section has a flow of assessing or surveying the field of current theories, the classic theories, quote unquote. And by the end, he says, now we're at consciousness, which is where we should have started to begin with. And then he goes to psychoanalysis, because at least they're dealing with consciousness in a sort of fairly eidetic way. But his critique of them is that they separated off. Um, he has some further critiques of Lewin and Dembo that involve the breakdown of one form must entail the reconstitution of a separate form. And that's why the breakdown of one feeling or one emotion or one conscious thing has to be the reintroduction of something else. And so every instant is transforming the world. Every instant is transforming consciousness. Um, and this again has to do with the adumbrated givenness, where all of being is expressed in every perception, basically. I've said this in different ways. This is the intuition of concrete duration as well. This is Spinoza's nature, the elemental. Winchester. But it's good to bring it all into phenomenology too, because phenomenology can, in some instances, in my opinion, become too methodological. Um, and I find that this text, at least, is very flexible. I hope to find that being and nothingness is also as flexible. I get disappointed when there's like really strong conclusions. Sometimes. Sometimes they're worthwhile. I think he does it well in this book. I think this is a good example. Yeah, so Sartre's alternative is that emotion is a transformation of the world where we retain um, agency, even though it is non-reflective, and which means we have responsibility, even though we're not paying self-aware attention to how it is generating and how it is transforming our interpretation and hermeneutics of the world, hermeneutics of existence. Um, he says it's a play acting that we fundamentally believe. So it's magical and it's magical thinking, and we go to a magical world. We adopt a magical attitude towards things where determinism is no longer strictly speaking assumed, taken for granted, necessary. Causal consistency might fall off the side in the magical world. Things just might turn out differently, some magical way. And emotion is this kind of thing. He uses the example of a face at the window with horror, because when we have the horror of the face at the window, or let's say the horror of a scary movie, films weren't necessary. I mean, they were around in Sartre's time. But the face at the window, we are immediately horrified. There's an immediacy between ourself and the other. And this immediacy is magical. It creates a co-constitution between us, but it also is magical because um, the deterministic world is broken down. We don't think about the deterministic considerations that would be um, quote unquote rational, and we become quote unquote irrational in our emotional perceptions. The emotions are believed with bodily reactions, which are the incantatory behavior that ritualizes the emotion, enacts it, instantiates it, as it were, the beginning ritual and the ending ritual. He also discusses exigencies or exigences. Exigences. Well, feeling exigence. I'm not sure if you can pluralize exigence. I don't think he does. Yeah, and there's a long discussion again of aesthetic and reflecting and positional aesthetic consciousness, positional consciousness, reflective behavior and non-reflective behavior. Um, it's not necessarily that non-reflective behavior is passive. In many cases, it's active. It would be impractical to be reflective all the time. So it kind of breaks the passive active distinction, or it confuses it. Because in Benjamin, passive absorption is kind of how you, um, well, anyway, sorry. I'm not sure I can parse that connection right now. All right, let's do. So I know I've explained the argument multiple times in each video in slightly different words, but um, hopefully that's helping you guys remember it. I certainly just think it's complicated. Um, like I think I kind of took it for granted how complicated it was. So again, I got the main strokes, but there's a lot of specific argumentation in here that you could chew on. Sketch for a theory of the emotions. We all know the criticisms that have been urged against the peripheric theory of the emotions. How can it explain the subtler emotions or passive enjoyment? How can we admit that ordinary organic reactions suffice to render an account of distinct psychic states? How can quantitative and by the same token quasi-continuous modifications in the vegetative functions correspond to a qualitative series of states irreducible to one another? For example, the physiological modifications which correspond to anger differ only by their intensity from those that accompany joy. Somewhat quicker respiratory rhythm, slight augmentation of muscular tone, increase of biochemical exchanges, of arterial tension, etc. For all that, anger is not a greater intensity of joy. It is something else, at least as it presents itself to consciousness. It would be useless to show that there is an excitation in joy which predisposes to anger, citing the cases of lunatics who are constantly passing from joy to anger, for instance, by rocking to and fro on a seat at an accelerating rhythm. The idiot who has become angry is not ultra joyful, even if he has passed from joy to anger, and there is nothing to justify our affirming that there has not been a number of psychic events meanwhile. Anger is irreducible to joy. It seems to me that the basis common to all these objections might be summarized thus. William James distinguishes in emotion two groups of phenomena, a group of physiological phenomena and a group of psychological phenomena, which we shall call, as he does, the state of consciousness. The essence of his thesis is that the states of consciousness called joy, anger, and so forth are nothing but the consciousness of physiological manifestations, or if you will, their projection into consciousness, their impingement into consciousness. Now, of all the critics of James who have successfully examined the state of consciousness, emotion, and the accompanying physiological manifestations, not one recognizes the former as being the projection of, or the shadow cast by, the latter. They find more in it, and, whether they are clearly conscious of this or not, something else. More, for whatever extravagance we may ascribe in imagination to the disorder of the body, we still fail to understand why the corresponding consciousness should be, for instance, a terrorized consciousness. Terror is an extremely painful, even unbearable state, and it is inconceivable that a bodily condition taken for itself and in itself could appear in consciousness with this atrocious character. Something else, for in effect, and even if the emotion objectively perceived presented itself as a physiological disorder, as a fact of consciousness, it is neither disorder nor chaos pure and simple. It has a meaning, it signifies something. And by this, we do not only mean that it is presented as a pure quality, it arises as a certain relation between our psychic being and the world. And this relation, or rather our awareness of it, is not a chaotic relationship between the self and the universe. It is an organized and intentional structure, an organized and describable structure. Sorry, I was just literally thinking of the intentionality structure, which is probably the relation. I mean, the relation between self and world is the intentionality structure between psychic being and the world. I cannot see that the cortothalamic sensitive, but I mean, he's leaning into these things. He hasn't necessarily proven them yet. He's asserting them. Um, he's eidetically proving them because they should make sense to us, and we should go, oh yeah, like the argument just makes sense. Um, and it only won't make sense if you refuse to trust that capacity of the humans, which is a major component of his argument. So we spent a lot of time in the introduction talking about how Husserl and Heidegger were willing to take advantage of the confidence of the absolute proximity of consciousness to itself. Okay, so still critiquing the classic theories, and we'll be critiquing for probably the rest of the video. We'll be like presenting, he'll keep presenting the theory and then saying what's wrong with it and giving it counterexamples and just developing the dialectic basically. But there are certain phrases that are really interesting, like empirical intuition. Um, yeah, I don't know if I'll think of any more of them, but I cannot see that the corticothalamic sensitivity, recently invented by the same people who made these criticisms of James, provides a satisfactory answer to the question. First of all, the peripheric theory of James had one big advantage. It took account only of physiological disturbances directly or indirectly discernible. Corticothalamic sensitivity would be like there being something kind of inside of your mind in your corticothalamus, if that's a thing, um, somewhere that had a sort of bouncing capacitative sensitivity. The theory of cerebral sensibility appeals to a cortical disturbance, so not cortical and thalamus, hypothalamus, that is unverifiable. Sherrington made some experiments on dogs, and one can certainly praise his operational dexterity. But these experiments, taken by themselves, prove absolutely nothing, simply because the head of a dog, practically isolated from its body, still gives signs of emotion, I cannot see that we have the right to conclude that the dog is feeling a complete emotion. I really don't know what Sherrington did. I don't know if he, um, I don't really want to talk about it. If it's bad, it's bad, but I don't think he beheaded dogs. I hope not. It'd be terrible. Besides, even supposing that the existence of a corticothalamic sensitivity were established, it would still be necessary to ask the previous question. Can a physiological disturbance, as a disturbance, whatever it may be, render an account of the organized character of an emotion, right? Because a disturbance cannot be an intentional, organized thing. That is what Janet very well understood, but expressed without much felicity when he said that James, in his description of emotion, had left out the psychic. So this is where he tries to reintroduce that kind of ethereal, ephemeral, magical quality of consciousness into the account. Basing himself exclusively upon objective grounds, Janet wants to register only the external manifestations of emotion, but even considering none but the organic phenomena that can be described and disclosed from the outside, he thinks that these phenomena are immediately susceptible of being classified under two categories: the psychic phenomena or behavior and the physiological phenomena. So this is part of what I said in the last episode that um, Sartre lists three components: the state of consciousness, the behavior, and the physical reaction. And he calls them different things when he's talking about different theorists. Um, but he sets them up as ordering in a singular flow without any reciprocity or bidirectionality, because that's what he's critiquing. But in this case in particular, the behavior is collapsed into psychic phenomena, whereas, um, like I mentioned, it seems like behavior should be something of that dialectic, simultaneously both and simultaneously bidirectionally influencing both. A theory of emotion which sought to restore the preponderant part played by the psyche would have to treat emotion as a kind of behavior. Yet, for all that, Janet is aware no less than James of the apparent disorder presented by every emotion. He therefore treats emotion as a behavior that is less well adaptive, or if one prefers, a behavior of disadaptation, a behavior of defeat. Remember that they think that emotion is a disorder because it comes upon the consciousness from the non-reflective plane and it generates at a non-reflective level and then you become aware of it when it's like fully formed. But it was there, and there are things that are doing that in the non-reflective plane. A behavior of defeat. When the task is too difficult and we cannot maintain the higher behavior appropriate to it, the psychic energy that has been released takes another path. We adopt an inferior behavior which necessitates a lesser psychic tension. Here, for instance, is a girl whose father has just told her that he has pains in the arms and that he has some fear of paralysis. She falls to the ground, prey to a violent emotion, which returns a few days later with the same violence, and which finally obliges her to seek help from doctors. In the course of her treatment, she confesses that the thought of nursing her father and leading the austere life of a nurse had suddenly appeared to her as insupportable. Here, then, the emotion represents an attitude of defeat. It is the substitute for the non-maintainable conduct of a nurse. Similarly, in his work on obsession and psychasthenia, Janet cites the cases of several patients who, coming to make confessions to him, could not finish their confessions, but broke down in tears, sometimes even bringing on a nervous crisis. Phobias, obsessions, compulsions, or excessive anxiety. Here again, that's what psychasthenia means. Psychological disorder involving uh, compulsions, obsessions, phobias, and anxieties. Here again, the required behavior is too difficult. The weeping or the nervous crisis represents a behavior of defeat, which substitutes itself for the former by diversion. The point needs no elaboration. Examples are abundant. Who does not remember having engaged in exchanges of raillery with a comrade and remaining calm so long as the competition seemed equal, but becoming irritated as soon as one found oneself with nothing more to say? Thus, Janet could pride himself upon having reintegrated the psyche with the emotions. The consciousness that we have of emotion, a consciousness which, moreover, is here only a secondary phenomenon, but not an epiphenomenon. Instead, consciousness is behavior of behaviors as a secondary phenomenon. Um, the consciousness that we have of emotion is no longer simply the correlative of physiological disturbances. It is the awareness of a defeat, which requires interpretation, and is a behavior of defeat. The theory looks attractive. It is indeed a psychological thesis, and yet it is of a quite mechanistic simplicity. The phenomenon of diversion is nothing more than a switching of the liberated nervous energy onto another line. So it's more than James because there is some kind of, the defeat is a kind of meaning, but because it's a defeat or a breakdown instead of a way of maintaining agency despite not being able to accomplish something, um, it's mechanistic instead of agent oriented. And so that's Sartre's critique of it. But that comes out in the third part. And yet, how many obscurities there are in these few notions which at first look so clear. Upon better consideration of the case, if Janet manages to improve upon James, it is only by making use implicitly of a finality which his theory explicitly repudiates. What, in fact, is a behavior of defeat? Are we simply to understand? So the finality is like, he's going to say that it's finality that should signify more than mechanism. So he starts to get it right, but on the same token gets it wrong without realizing what was behind it, basically. What, in fact, is a behavior of defeat? Are we simply to understand by this an automatic substitute for the superior line of conduct that we cannot pursue? In that case, the nervous energy would be discharged at hazard, according to the law of the least resistance. But then the emotive reactions would be less like a behavior of defeat than a lack of behavior. Instead, and it would or than a diffuse behavior. Instead of an adapted reaction, there would be a diffuse organic reaction, a disorder. But is not that just what James is saying? So this is where he's going to take it back to kind of say he starts to develop James, but he doesn't get much further past him. Does not the emotion, in his view, intervene precisely at the moment of the breakdown of an adaptation? And does it not consist essentially of the sum of the disorders that this non-adaptation entails for the organism? No doubt Janet puts the emphasis more than James does upon the defeat. But what are we to understand by it? If we regard the individual objectively as a system of behavior, and if the deviation takes place automatically, then there is no defeat. It does not exist. All that happens is the replacement of one kind of behavior by a diffuse set of organic manifestations. If emotion is to have the psychic significance of defeat, consciousness must intervene and confer that signification upon it. There must be a conscious retention of the superior conduct as a possibility, and a consciousness of the emotion as a defeat precisely in relation to that superior behavior. This is why a behavior defeat is so interpretive and requires memory. This is also why the cogito signifies much further than just the cogito. It signifies every other person's cogito. But that would be to give consciousness a constitutive function, which Janet will not have at any price. If one wanted to preserve a meaning in Janet's theory, one would be logically obliged to adopt the position of M. Wallon, who, in his article in the Revue de Corps et Conferences, puts forward the following interpretation. In the infant, there is a primitive nerve circuit. All the reactions of a newborn child to tickling, pain, and so on, shiverings, diffused muscular contractions, acceleration of the cardiac rhythm, etc., are under the control of this circuit and would thus constitute a primary organic adaptation, an inherited adaptation, of course. Later on, we learn how to behave and set up new patterns of reaction, that is, new circuits. But when in a new and difficult situation, we cannot produce adapted behavior appropriate to it, we fall back upon the primitive nervous circuit. We can see that this theory represents a transposition of Janet's view into the sphere of pure behaviorism. For what it amounts to is that the emotional reactions are not seen as a mere disorder, but as a lesser adaptation. The first organized system of defensive reflexes, that of the infant's nerve circuit, is ill adapted to cope with the needs of the adult. But in itself, it is a functional organization, analogous to the respiratory reflex, for instance. But we can also see that this thesis differs from that of James only upon the presupposition of an organic unity linking all the emotive manifestations together. It goes without saying that James would have accepted the existence of such a circuit without embarrassment if it had been proved. He would then have held that this modification of his own theory was of little importance because it was of a purely physiological order. Janet, therefore, if we hold him strictly to the terms of his thesis, is much closer to James than he would have cared to say. So he brings part of the way that he brings Janet into alignment with James to kind of critique them both together is to pull James closer to Janet too. He has failed in his attempt to reintroduce the psychic into emotion, Janet that is, nor has Janet explained why there are various kinds of behavior in defeat, why I may react to a sudden aggression by fear or by anger. The cases he recounts, moreover, are almost all reducible to emotional perturbations, not very different from one another. Tears, nervous attacks, etc., much nearer to emotional shock, properly so called, than to emotion as such. But in Janet's work, there seems to be an underlying theory of emotion, and also of behavior in general, which would reintroduce finality without mentioning it. In his general expositions concerning psychasthenia or affectivity, he insists, as we have said, upon the automatic character of the diversion, which makes it mechanistic. But in many of his descriptions, he gives us to understand that the patient falls back upon the inferior behavior in order not to maintain the superior behavior. Here it is the patient himself who proclaims his defeat, even before he engages in the struggle, and the emotional behavior supervenes to mask his inability to pursue the line of adapted behavior. Let us return to the example we were citing above. The patient who comes to see Janet wants to entrust him with the secret of her troubles and a minute description of her obsessions. But she cannot. This is social behavior that is too difficult for her. Then she bursts into tears. But is she weeping because she can say nothing? Is her sobbing a vain effort to do so? A diffuse upheaval that represents the decomposition of the behavior she has found too difficult, like trying to stand up but falling down. Or rather, is she not crying precisely in order not to say anything? Between these two interpretations, the difference may seem small at first sight. By both hypotheses, a course of behavior proves impossible to maintain, and according to either, there is a replacement of this behavior, by diffuse manifestations. Besides, Janet passes freely from the one to the other. That is what makes his theory ambiguous. This is what I was saying before. For in reality, there is an abyss of difference between the two interpretations. The former is, in effect, purely mechanistic and, as we have seen, is at bottom fairly close to James's views. The latter, on the other hand, really introduces something new. It alone truly deserves the name of a psychological theory of the emotions. It alone treats emotion as a way of behaving. For indeed, if we are here reintroducing finality, we can well conceive that emotional behavior is not a disorder at all, that it is an organized pattern of means directed to an end. And these means are summoned up in order to mask, replace, or reject a line of conduct that one cannot or will not pursue. At the same time, the explanation of the diversity of emotions becomes easy. They represent, each one of them, a different way of eluding a difficulty, a particular way of escape, a special trick. But Janet has given us what he could. He is too uncertain, divided between a finality that is spontaneous and free and conscious, and a mechanism on principle. It is not to him that we look for an exposition of this pure theory of emotional behavior. We find it in outline among the disciples of Kohler, and notably in Lewin and Dembo. Here is what P. Giame writes about this subject in his Psychologie de la Forme. Giame is spelled Guillaume. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. Lewin is Lewin, and Dembo is Dembo. Let us take the simple, and this is a long, like 3-page quote from Giame. Let us take the simplest example. We ask a subject to reach for an object placed upon a chair, but without putting a foot outside a circle traced upon the ground. The distances are so calculated as to make the act very difficult or impossible by direct means, but the problem can be resolved by indirect means. Here, the force directed towards the object takes on a clear, concrete meaning. On the other hand, these problems present an obstacle to the direct execution of the action, an obstacle that may be either material or moral. For instance, a rule one is undertaken to observe. Thus, in our example, the circle that one must not overstep presents to the perception of the subject a barrier, from which there emanates a force directly in opposition to the former. The conflict between the two forces, between the the tension between the obstacle and the direct execution of the action. Um, a barrier emanating a force in opposition to the subject, I guess. The conflict between the two forces sets up a tension in the phenomenal field. If the solution is found, the successful action puts an end to the tension. There is a whole psychology of the act of replacement or substitution of the ersatz to which the school of Lewin has made an interesting contribution. I think ersatz literally just means substitution or replacement. It might be like parapraxis and Freud, but that's psychoanalysis is the next. Um, its form is psychoanalysis is the next section. Its form is very variable. The partial result achieved may help to fix it. Sometimes the subject facilitates the act by freeing himself from some of the imposed conditions of quantity, quality, speed, or duration, and even by modifying the nature of his task. In other cases, he performs unreal, symbolic actions. One makes an obviously useless gesture in the direction of the act. Another describes the action instead of performing it, or imagines chimerical, fictive procedures. If only I had, one would need outside the real or imposed conditions for its accomplishment. If acts of substitution are impossible or do not produce an adequate solution, The tension persists, manifested by a tendency to abandon the problem, to wander away, or to withdraw into one's own thoughts, in an attitude of passivity. As we have said, indeed, the subject finds himself subjected to the positive attraction of the end in view and to the negative repellent influence of the barrier. Furthermore, the fact that he has consented to undergo the trial has conferred a negative value upon all the other objects in the field, in the sense that all diversions irrelevant to the task are ipso facto impossible, as it stands, basically. The subject is thus imprisoned, as it were, in a space fenced in on every side. There is only one positive way out, and that is closed by the specific barrier. This situation corresponds to the diagram below. The circle that can't be left. I tried to label this the best I could. I hope I did this right. Actually, I was kind of confused by the diagram. It's mostly fair. Escape, I mean, and this wasn't even Sartre, this is Giame. Escape is a merely barbarous solution, for it means breaking through the barrier and accepting a diminution of the self, falling back upon oneself, insistment, which erects a protective barrier between the hostile field of action and oneself, is another equally mediocre solution. Prolongation of the ordeal may end in emotional disorders or in other and still more primitive ways of liberating the tensions. The fits of anger, sometimes very violent, which supervene in certain persons, have been capably studied in the work of T. Dembo. The situation undergoes a structural simplification. In anger, and doubtless in all the emotions, there is a weakening of the barriers that separate the deeper from the more superficial levels of the self, which normally ensure the regulation of action by the deep personality and maintain the self-control. A weakening of the barriers between the real and the unreal. On the other hand, because the path to action is blocked, tensions between the external and the internal continue to augment. A negative character extends uniformly to all the objects in the field. They lose their proper value. The privileged way towards the goal having vanished, the differentiated structure that the problem had imposed upon the field is destroyed. The particular facts, notably the various physiological reactions which we are pleased to describe by attaching particular meanings to them, are not intelligible unless we start from this integral conception of the topology of emotion. Topology is like a study of the possible transformations in surfaces and what qualities persist despite the transformations. It's also like a mapping. I mean, it's not topography. It is more of the transmutations. Here then, at the end of this long quotation, we arrive at a functional conception of anger. Clearly, anger is not, this is Sartre again. Clearly, anger is not an instinct nor a habit, nor is it a calculated action. It is an abrupt solution of conflict, a way of cutting the Gordian knot. And we are back again at Janet's distinction between the superior kind of behavior and the inferior or derived. But here, that distinction assumes its full meaning. It is we who put ourselves into a state of total inferiority, because at that very low level, our demands are smaller. We satisfy ourselves at less cost. Being unable in a state of high tension to find the delicate and precise answer to a problem, we act upon ourselves. We abase and transform ourselves into a being for whom the grossest and least adapted solutions are good enough. For example, tearing up the paper on which a problem is stated. Thus, anger now appears as an escape. The angry subject is like a man who is unable to untie the knots of the cords that bind him and who writhes about in his bonds. And the angry conduct, though less well adapted to the problem than the superior and impossible behavior that would solve it, is still precisely and perfectly adapted to his need to break the tension, to shake the leaden weight off his shoulders. We shall be better able to understand the examples we were citing above. The psychasthenic who comes to see Janet wants to make her confession to him, but the task is too difficult. Here she is in a confined, threatening world, which is waiting for her to perform a definite action and at the same time repelling her. It's the world that's repelling her. Janet himself signifies by his attitude that he is listening and is attentive, but at the same time, his prestige, his personality, etc., repulse that confession. Escape she must from the unbearable tension, and the patient can do so only by exaggerating her weakness and her disarray, by distracting his attention from the task in hand and turning it upon herself. How unhappy I am! Her own demeanor will transform Janet from her judge into her comforter by exteriorizing and playing up the very impossibilities she finds in speaking, by commuting the precise need to give such and such information into a heavy, undifferentiated pressure of the whole world upon her. It is then that the sobbing and the nervous crisis ensue. So I find this to be difficult because, again, there's a simultaneity with Sartre where he's repeatedly asserting that, like this whole passage, this patient is doing this, but she's not conscious that she's doing this. She fully believes that she is going through these emotions. He says that later in the third section. It's something, it's a play acting we fully believe. Emotion is a belief about the world. He says that too. Um, those are some of the other great quotes that stuck out. So it can come across as harsh, but he's trying to show the simultaneity of first person agency with third person worlding, so to speak. Um, and the interplay between consciousness and world, right? What's the direction of that? Is it constantly informing? Is one strictly more determinate than the other? Does the belief really determine the world? Um, anyway, and again, he says that Janet is repulsing the confession. So similarly, it is easy to understand the fit of anger that seizes me when I can think of nothing more to reply to a mocker. Here, anger does not play quite the same part as in the example given by Dembo. My need is to switch the discussion onto another plane. I have not been witty enough, so I become formidable and intimidating. I want to arouse fear. At the same time, I make use of inferior alternatives, ersatz, to vanquish my adversary, insults, threats which have to do instead of the shaft of wit I fail to think of. For the abrupt change of attitude that I impose upon myself makes me less exacting about the choice of means. And yet, at the point we have come to, we still feel unsatisfied. The emotional behavior theory is perfect, but in its purity and perfection, we can see its insufficiency. In all the examples we have quoted, the functional part played by emotion is indubitable, but as it stands, it is also incomprehensible. I mean that for Dembo and the Gestalt psychologists, the passage from the state of seeking to the state of anger is explained as the breakup of one form and the reconstitution of another. And I can understand, if need be, the breakup of the form, problem without solution. But how can I admit the appearance of the other form? Like, what's its relationship to the breakdown of the first form? Like, why did that specific next form come up? We must suppose that it presents itself clearly as the substitute for the previous form. It exists only in relation to this. We have then a single process, a transformation of form. But I cannot comprehend this transformation without first positing consciousness. Consciousness alone, by its synthetic activity, can break up and reconstitute forms without ceasing. It alone can account for the finality of emotion. So the synthetic activity is ceaseless. And that's what I've been describing as the constant refreshing of the world. Moreover, we have seen that the whole of the description of anger given by Giame, according to Dimbo, shows that its aim is to transform the aspect of the world. It serves to, quote, weaken the barriers between the real and the unreal, to, quote, destroy the differentiated structure that the problem has imposed upon the world. Admirable, but as soon as it is a question of positing a relation of the world to the self, we can no longer content ourselves with psychology of form. It is quite clear that we must have recourse to the consciousness. And besides, is it not to consciousness, after all, that Giame is referring when he says that the angry subject, quote, weakens the barriers that separate the deeper from the more superficial levels of the self? Thus, the physiological theory of James has led us, by its own insufficiency, to Janet's theory of behavior, the latter to the theory of functional emotion and form psychology, the long quote from Giame about Lewin and Dimbo. And this refers us at last to the consciousness. That is where we ought to have begun, and it is now high time for us to formulate the real problem. All right, we have time in this episode to do the second section. It's much shorter. It's like 5 pages. And it might be 7. Yeah, it's 6 or 7. We should have time for it though. So, section 2, the psychoanalytic theory. And again, our guiding question here is uh, why is the psychoanalytic theory of emotion as an unconscious resolution of drives, urges, impulses, or tensions still inadequate? And that's because it's causal rather than structural or intrastructural. It separates the symbolization process from the givenness of consciousness or the presentation or the appearance of perception. Um, and it posits an unconscious. I think there's a critique of the unconscious and being in nothingness that is more in depth than what we see here. But like I said in the other videos, I think it's already present in this text. Sorry, I need to take care of my eye. Okay, I'm back. Mhm. I'm all bundled up because I've got my AC stupid cold. I don't really understand why. I just really enjoy it. It feels cozy. Um, Snug? I don't know. All right. 2, the psychoanalytic theory. We cannot understand an emotion unless we look for its signification, and this, by its nature, is of a functional order. We are therefore led to speak of a finality of emotion. This finality we can grasp very concretely by the objective examination of emotional behavior. Here, there is no question at all of a more or less obscure theory about emotion instinct based upon a priori principles or postulates. Simple consideration of the facts brings us to an empirical intuition of the finalist meaning of emotion. If we try, on the other hand, to fix in a complete intuition the essence of emotion as an inter-psychological fact, we see that this finality is inherent in its structure. And all the psychologists who have reflected upon the peripheric theory of James have been more or less aware of this finalistic signification. There's a typo in the text. There is in the digital copy, and there is in my copy, and I assume there is in most other copies. But it literally reads all the psychologists who have reflected upon the peripheric space feric space theory. So it repeats the feric part of peripheric without the peri. So I just crossed out that in my copy. And all the psychologists who have reflected upon the peripheric theory of James have been more or less aware of this finalistic signification. This is what Janet, for instance, decorates with the name of psychic. See, this is the finality of emotion literally is that the moreness of consciousness that you couldn't just explain as the pure feeling itself. It is this that psychologists or physiologists like Cannon and Sherrington try to reintroduce into their descriptions of the emotional facts with their hypothesis of a cerebral sensibility. It is this, again, that we find in Wallen, or more recently among the Gestalt psychologists. This finality presupposes a synthetic organization of behavior, which could only be the unconscious of psychoanalysis or consciousness. And the synthetic organization of behavior could also be created. Why he said the reason he says or consciousness at the end is because he argued at the end of the last, just a few minutes ago, at the end of the last section, that only constant consciousness is constantly updating synthetic function. How did you describe it? Synthetic what? It's like 2 pages back. Activity can break up and reconstitute forms without ceasing. And so he's going to critique the idea of the unconscious in psychoanalysis and show that it really needs to be something more like a phenomenological consciousness. And it would be easy enough, if need be, where phenomenological consciousness is understood as an interrelation of self-other, uh, body world, perception world, etc. Interrelation and unification and alternation and simultaneity. One could show, without great difficulty, sorry, let's just go back a few sentences. This finality presupposes a synthetic organization of behavior, which could only be the unconscious of psychoanalysis or consciousness. And it would be easy enough, if need be, to produce a psychoanalytic theory of emotional finality. Seems like Sophia went under the bed. When she goes under the bed, he like goes to go after her. I saw her walk behind me. So for the third time reading this sentence, it would be easy enough if need be. I just think it's important to understand the next sentence in flow. It would be easy enough, if need be, to produce a psychoanalytic theory of emotional finality. One could show without great difficulty that anger or fear are means employed by unconscious urges to achieve symbolic satisfaction, to break out of a state of unbearable tension. One could thus account for this essential characteristic of emotion, that it is suffered, that it surprises, develops of itself according to its own laws, and that conscious efforts cannot modify its course to any very appreciable extent. This dissociation between the organized character of emotion, the organizing theme being relegated to the unconscious, and its ineluctable character, which it would not have for the consciousness of the subject, um, would render something like the same service in the psychological domain as the Kantian distinction between the empirical and the noumenal does in the domain of metaphysics. It is certainly true that psychoanalysis was the first to lay the emphasis upon the signification of psychic facts. That is, it was the first to insist upon the fact that every state of consciousness stands for something other than itself. So yeah, when we talk about psychoanalysis, or when he writes about psychoanalysis, there's like these strange uh mentions of like sexual obsession or um interpretation of phenomena in sexual ways, which Sartre points out like doesn't make sense, but it's still like he still mentions it. For example, this clumsy theft perpetrated by a sexually obsessive who is not simply a clumsy theft for the psychoanalyst. It refers to something else from the moment that we begin to consider it in the psychoanalyst way as a phenomenon of self-punishment. Then it refers to the primary complex for which the patient is seeking to justify himself through self-punishment. We can see that a psychoanalytic theory of the emotions would be possible. Does it not already exist? There is that woman with a phobia for Laurel. And then I don't think his treatment of like, I don't know, I just don't think you need to mention uh, childhood sexual trauma as a case study example. But again, he's critiquing psychoanalysis. So um, if she sees a clump of laurel, she faints. The psychoanalyst discovers that in her childhood there was a painful sexual incident associated with laurel bushes. What will be the corresponding emotion? A phenomenon of refusal and of censorship. Not refusal of the laurel itself, but a refusal to relive the memory connected with laurels. Here, the emotion is a flight from the revelation to follow, as sleep is sometimes a flight from a decision to be taken, and as the illnesses of certain young women are, according to Steckel, a flight from marriage. Naturally, emotion is not always an escape. We already have indications from the psychoanalysts of an interpretation of anger as a symbolic gratification of sexual tendencies. So instead of an escape, it's like a completion or attainment. And certainly none of these interpretations is to be thrust aside. That anger can signify sadism is in no doubt at all. That fainting away from passive fears signifies flight, the quest of a refuge, is also certain. He spends a lot of time talking about fainting away and passive fear, um, mostly in section 3. And we shall try to show the reason for it. What is in question here is the principle itself of psychoanalytic explanation. So in this section, he's just worried about that. That is what we want to consider here. The psychoanalytic interpretation conceives the conscious phenomenon as the symbolic realization of a desire repressed by the censor. Note that for consciousness, the desire is not involved in its symbolic realization. Insofar as it exists by and in our consciousness, it is only what it gives itself out to be. Emotion, desire for sleep, theft, lorophobia, etc. If it were otherwise, if we had any consciousness, even only implicit, of the real desire, we should be in bad faith. And that is not what the psychoanalyst means. It follows that the signification of our conscious behavior lies wholly outside that behavior itself. So I was just considering whether here, when he talks about consciousness, if he means phenomenology, he doesn't. He does just mean consciousness, but his argument is that we can't live a life thinking that we don't know ourselves. That's bad faith. It's just impossible. It follows that the signification of our conscious behavior lies wholly outside that behavior itself, or, if one prefers it so, what is signified is entirely cut off from the signifier. This behavior of the subject is in itself just what it is, if by in itself we mean for itself. But it can be deciphered by the appropriate techniques as one would decipher a given language. In a word, the conscious fact is related to what it signifies, as a thing which is the effect of a certain event is related to that event. So this is where he talks about not only is it because of bad faith, but it's also um, to think of there being some process at all which produces the given perception is to one, not take the given perception as immediately given wholly in its immediacy. Um, but two is to create a causal process where there is only an intrastructural transformation of conscious perceptions, constantly refreshing through synthetic activity. So again, in a word, the conscious fact is related to what it signifies, as a thing which is the effect of a certain event is related to that event. As, for example, the ashes of a fire extinct upon a mountain are related to the human beings who lit the fire. Their presence is not contained in the remaining cinders, but connected with them by a relation of causality. The relation is external. The ashes of the fire are passive, considered in that causal relation, as every effect is in relation to its cause. A consciousness which had not acquired the necessary technical knowledge could not grasp these remains as signs which signify something else. At the same time, the remains are what they are. That is, they exist in themselves, irrespective of all significant interpretation. They are fragments of half-burnt wood, and that is all. Can we admit that a fact of consciousness could be like a thing in relation to its signification, that is, receive its meaning from outside like an external quality, as, for instance, this having been burnt by men who wanted to warm themselves is a quality external to the burnt wood? It would seem, first and foremost, that the effect of such an interpretation is to make consciousness into a thing in relation to what is signified. It is to admit that consciousness can constitute itself into a meaning without being aware of the meaning that it constitutes. There is a flagrant contradiction in this, unless we are to regard consciousness as an existent of the same type as a stone or a pond, which gets its meaning from outside. But in that case, we must finally give up the Cartesian cogito and treat consciousness as a secondary and passive phenomenon. Insofar as a consciousness makes itself, it is never anything other than what it appears to be. If then it has a signification, it must contain this within itself as a structure of consciousness. This does not mean that the signification must be perfectly explicit. There are many possible degrees of condensation and of clarity. It only means that we should not interrogate the consciousness from outside, as one would study the remains of the fire or the encampment, but from within, that we should look into it for the signification. The consciousness, if the cogito is to be possible, is itself the fact, the signification, and what is signified. Truth to tell, what makes an exhaustive refutation of psychoanalysis so difficult is that the psychoanalyst himself does not regard the signification as conferred entirely from outside the consciousness. For him, there is always an internal analogy between the conscious fact and the desire it expresses, since the conscious fact is symbolical of the expressed complex. And for the psychoanalyst, the symbolic character, since it's different than the relation it has to the outside world completely. But the symbolic analogy isn't quite constitutive enough. And for the psychoanalyst, the symbolic character is obviously not external to the fact itself, but is constitutive of it. Upon this point, we are in full agreement with him that the symbolization is constitutive of the symbolic consciousness can be in no doubt whatever to anyone who believes in the absolute value of the Cartesian cogito. But this needs to be rightly understood. If symbolization is constitutive, it is legitimate to see an imminent bond of comprehension between the symbolization and the symbol. Only we must agree upon this, that consciousness constitutes itself by symbolization. So the bond must be that same transformation of itself. In that case, there is nothing behind it, and the relation between symbol, symbolized, and symbolization is an intrastructural bond of consciousness. But if we go on to say that the consciousness is symbolizing under the causal compulsion of a transcendent fact, which is the repressed desire. So if we go on to say that that it's not all immediately there, we are falling back upon the theory previously indicated, which treats the relation of the signified to the signifying as a causal relation. The profound contradiction in all psychoanalysis is that it presents at the same time a bond of causality and a bond of understanding between the phenomena that it studies. These two types of relationship are incompatible. Another random mention of sexual metaphor coming up. The theorist of psychoanalysis also establishes transcendent relations of rigid causality between the facts under observation. A pincushion in a dream always signifies a woman's breasts. Entry into a carriage signifies the sexual act. Whilst the practitioner assures himself of success by studying, that is, by flexible research into the intraconscious relation between symbolization and symbol. But those are transcendent relations of rigid causality between those things. For our part, we do not reject the findings of psychoanalysis when they are obtained by the understanding. We limit ourselves to the denial that there is any value or intelligibility in its underlying theory of psychic causality. And moreover, we affirm that insofar as the psychoanalyst is making use of understanding to interpret consciousness, it would be better to recognize frankly that whatever is going on in consciousness can receive its explanation nowhere but from consciousness itself. And here we are brought back to our own point of departure. A theory of consciousness which attributes meaningful character to the emotive facts must look for that meaning in the consciousness itself. This is why it must be what is signified as well. So the fact is the actual given phenomena. The signification is what it means, and what it means is some other aspect of consciousness or the fact itself, or the process or the structure. It can reveal those things as well. In other words, It is the consciousness which makes itself conscious, moved by the inner need for an inner signification. And indeed, the advocates of psychoanalysis are at the same time raising the difficulty of principle. This inner need for an inner signification really reminds me of Being Singular Plural by Jean-Luc Nancy, where he says that meaning is the circulation, we are meaning. And what that means when we say that we are meaning is that we determine meaning, but we also attribute meaning, and we are valuable. We are what is fundamentally first and foremost valuable. And so by circulating between each other, conversation, love, um, labor, practice, care, attention, cooking, shelter, all these things, teaching, uh, we create meaning. It's all part of that signification process. And indeed, the advocates of psychoanalysis are at the same time raising the difficulty of principle. If consciousness organizes emotion as a special type of response adapted to an external situation, how does it manage to have no consciousness of this adaptation? And it must be granted that their theory renders a perfect account of this discrepancy between the signification and the consciousness, which need not astonish us, since that is just what it was made for. Better still, they will say in the majority of cases we are struggling in our conscious spontaneity against the development of emotional manifestations. We are trying to master our fear, to calm our anger, to restrain our weeping. Thus, we have not only no consciousness of any finality of emotion, we are also rejecting emotion with all our strength, and it invades us in spite of ourselves. A phenomenological description of emotion ought to resolve these contradictions. So we've looked at the classic theories and looked at the psychoanalytic theories, and he's started to explain like where they're wrong and what his view is. But then in this last section, these last 20, 30 pages, 25, 30 pages, we'll get a full kind of unpoisoned view of the more phenomenological version of what he's thinking without having to work sort of backwards from critiquing. Um, and that's why it resolves the contradictions because there just aren't as many contradictions presented anymore because he's not considering the problems with it anymore. And he's just explaining why it makes sense. So, that comes to, I don't know how long the gap was, but that's pretty close to our 90-minute mark. Um, I might be able to get a tax out of Winchester if you guys want to see. Winchester, come here. He groaned. Come here. Oh boy. Oh, boy. All right, guys. Thanks for being here. Isn't he cute? He's so sweet. Hmm. All right. See you next time.